He was locked away for 27 years, yet his voice grew louder with each passing day. He was called a terrorist, a troublemaker, and then he became a president. Nelson Mandela didn't just fight a system. He dismantled it. With nothing but his courage, his dignity, and his unbreakable spirit, he brought a divided nation back from the edge of war, and showed the world the true meaning of freedom. But who was he before the fame? Before the prison? What makes a man endure so much pain, and still choose peace? This is not just the story of South Africa. It's the story of a man who changed history, and taught us that forgiveness is more powerful than revenge. This is the life of Nelson Mandela. And it all began in a small village far from the world stage. Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in the small village of Mvizo in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa. He was born into the Thembu royal family, a branch of the Xhosa nation, and his birth name was Ralilila Mandela, which in the Xhosa language means pulling the branch of a tree, a phrase often interpreted as troublemaker. His father, Gadla Henry Mfakaniazwa, was a local chief and counselor to the Thembu king, but when Mandela was still a young boy, his father was stripped of his title and fortune by the colonial authorities for standing up to their decisions. This event plunged the family into poverty, but also planted in young Mandela the seeds of resistance to injustice. His father died when Mandela was only 9 years old, and he was then sent to live with Chief John Jintaba Dalindibo, the acting regent of the Thembu people, who had promised Mandela's father he would look after the boy. Living in the regent's household introduced Mandela to both the traditions of his people and the formal ways of leadership and governance. He watched how decisions were made, how disputes were settled, and how dignity could coexist with authority. Even as a young boy, Mandela carried himself with a quiet strength, a deep curiosity, and a growing sense that the world around him was deeply unjust. He attended local missionary schools, where he was given the name Nelson by a teacher, a common practice of the time for African children. Mandela later attended the prestigious Clarkberry Boarding Institute and then Helltown, a respected Methodist school. His academic promise was clear, and eventually, he went on to enroll at the University of Fort Hare, the only university available to black South Africans at the time. It was there, among fellow African students from all across the continent, that Mandela's political consciousness began to truly awaken. Though still quiet and measured in speech, Mandela began to see more clearly the full scope of white supremacy, segregation, and colonial arrogance, and he found himself increasingly unwilling to accept a life lived in quiet obedience. His time at Fort Hare was cut short, however, when he joined a student protest and was expelled. Returning home, he was told a marriage had been arranged for him, but refusing to accept a life chosen by others, Mandela fled to Johannesburg, a move that would mark the beginning of his transformation from a rural prince in training into a revolutionary who would shake the foundations of a nation. Arriving in Johannesburg as a young man, Mandela was exposed to the brutal realities of apartheid, a legal system built entirely to enforce racial segregation and white supremacy. Working first as a security guard and later as a law clerk at a firm run by liberal white attorneys, Mandela quickly realized that black South Africans lived under a constant cloud of surveillance, humiliation, and violence. The city was alive with tension. Past laws forced black workers to carry internal passports, police raids targeted homes without cause, and people lived in townships riddled with poverty while the white minority controlled every aspect of power. It was in this environment that Mandela began to seek purpose beyond personal ambition. He met a circle of African intellectuals, activists, and communists who introduced him to revolutionary ideas. In 1944, along with Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and other young leaders, Mandela joined the African National Congress, ANC, South Africa's oldest black liberation movement. But Mandela and his peers were not content with the ANC's slow, moderate approach. They wanted bolder, direct action, and together they formed the ANC Youth League. Mandela's sense of justice was no longer academic, it became a living force within him. He studied law by day and organized meetings by night. He was inspired by Pan-Africanism, Indian independence, and the example of leaders like Gandhi, whose nonviolent resistance moved him deeply. But even as Mandela initially believed in peaceful protest, he understood that in a country where peaceful protest was met with bullets, resistance might one day require more than petitions. He began to emerge not just as an organizer, but as a leader, a man who could command a room with his presence and speak with fierce clarity about the need for dignity, land, and freedom. His activism came at great personal cost, strained relationships, government watch lists, and constant fear. But Mandela never wavered, because he had found something larger than himself. The fight for equality had become his life's purpose. In 1948, apartheid became the official law of the land. The National Party, dominated by white Afrikaners, formalized decades of racial segregation into an inescapable legal framework. Every aspect of life was divided: schools, neighborhoods, jobs, transportation, and black South Africans were stripped of political representation, property rights, and even basic humanity. For Mandela, this marked a turning point. Peaceful petitions were no longer enough. Alongside his colleagues, he began to lead campaigns of civil disobedience, boycotts, strikes, and acts of defiance that tested the limits of the regime's patience. Mandela quickly rose in the ranks of the ANC, earning a reputation as both a brilliant strategist and a charismatic orator. He traveled across South Africa, urging people to rise in unity and reclaim their rights. But with every step forward, the state cracked down harder. Police brutality increased, meetings were banned, and activists were arrested without trial. Despite this, Mandela's belief in justice remained unshaken. With Oliver Tambo, he also opened South Africa's first black law firm, offering legal aid to victims of apartheid. The work was draining: long days, endless surveillance, and constant death threats. But Mandela's resolve only deepened. As the government hardened, so too did the resistance. The Sharpeville massacre in 1960, in which police opened fire on peaceful protesters and killed 69 people, marked a dark chapter that convinced Mandela that nonviolence alone could not defeat tyranny. The world was watching, but the world was silent. Mandela, however, was not. The time for symbolic resistance had passed. A new phase of the struggle had begun, one that would lead Mandela underground and eventually into the heart of history. By the early 1960s, Mandela knew that apartheid was not a system that could be reasoned with. It was a violent regime maintained through fear, imprisonment, and murder. And so, with great sadness and deep calculation, Mandela and others formed Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation, the armed wing of the ANC. This was not a decision made lightly. Mandela believed in the sanctity of life, but he also believed that dignity and freedom were not gifts to be begged, for they had to be taken. The new organization launched a campaign of sabotage, targeting infrastructure, symbols of apartheid, and government buildings, never civilians. Mandela went underground, moving from safe house to safe house, always one step ahead of the police. He was dubbed the Black Pimpernel by the press, a shadow figure who had become both a national legend and the most wanted man in South Africa. But in 1962, Mandela was captured and arrested. Initially sentenced for inciting strikes and traveling abroad illegally, his trial led to broader investigations. In 1963, at the Rivonia trial, Mandela and his comrades were charged with sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. Facing the death penalty, Mandela stood in court and gave a speech that would shake the world. With steady voice and unshakable courage, he declared, "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." The court sentenced him to life in prison. And just like that, the man who had become the voice of his people was silenced, but only in body. In spirit, he was louder than ever. Mandela was sent to Robben Island, a brutal prison off the coast of Cape Town, known for its isolation, hard labor, and the psychological torment inflicted upon inmates. There, he spent 18 of his 27 years in a cramped cell with no bed, a bucket for a toilet, and a window the size of a brick. Days were spent breaking rocks in the quarry under the blinding sun, while nights were filled with silence and reflection. The regime tried to break him physically, mentally, spiritually, but Mandela refused to be broken. He read constantly, wrote secretly, and organized political education circles for prisoners. He became a father figure to younger inmates, and a quiet symbol of resilience to the guards who both feared and respected him. Letters from family were censored or delayed, and he missed the death of his mother and son while behind bars. Still, Mandela never allowed bitterness to consume him. He used prison as a university, a place to sharpen his mind and deepen his understanding of leadership, forgiveness, and the long arc of justice. Over the years, the global anti-apartheid movement grew stronger. Posters of Mandela began appearing across college campuses. World leaders, artists, and athletes called for his release. His name became a symbol of courage. Though South Africans could not see his face, they spoke of him with reverence. Madiba, they called him, his Xhosa clan name, evoking not just a man, but a living legacy. Robben Island was meant to erase him. Instead, it transformed him into a myth, a martyr, and eventually, a president in waiting. While Mandela remained behind bars, his influence only intensified beyond South Africa's borders. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the global movement to end apartheid became a force that no government could ignore. Massive protests erupted in London, New York, Lagos, and Stockholm. International musicians like Stevie Wonder, Bob Marley, and Peter Gabriel wrote songs demanding Mandela's freedom. The slogan "Free Nelson Mandela" became a rallying cry for justice everywhere. Countries imposed sanctions on South Africa, companies divested, and athletes boycotted South African teams. The apartheid regime found itself increasingly isolated, condemned by the United Nations, and under growing economic pressure. Inside South Africa, mass uprisings spread like wildfire, from the Soweto uprising of 1976, where schoolchildren were gunned down for demanding education in their own language, to waves of strikes and civil disobedience. The nation was on the brink of collapse. And still, Mandela remained imprisoned, but he had become the heartbeat of the resistance. Letters smuggled from his cell showed a leader not broken by time but sharpened by it. He urged unity, dialogue, and discipline. He spoke of peace with dignity, not submission. The apartheid government, desperate to maintain power, quietly began secret talks with Mandela in the 1980s. They hoped to find a compromise. Mandela refused to accept conditional freedom or any deal that left his people in chains. He would not leave prison unless all South Africans were free. By the late 1980s, it became clear apartheid was dying and Mandela's time was coming. On February 11, 1990, the world stood still as Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison, tall, calm, hand in hand with Winnie Mandela, fist raised in victory. It was a moment that felt like a dream. After 27 years of captivity, Mandela returned not as a victim, but as a statesman. His walk was slow, but his voice was strong. That very day, he addressed the world and said he was committed to peace, but peace with justice. The road ahead was dangerous. South Africa teetered on the edge of civil war. White extremists threatened violence, black factions clashed with each other, and hope battled with fear. But Mandela remained steady. He negotiated with President F.W. de Klerk, engaged with opponents, and held together a fragile alliance of movements. He called for forgiveness, not revenge, for rebuilding, not retribution. He famously invited his former jailers to the negotiation table. For many, it seemed impossible. But Mandela understood that leadership meant sacrifice, restraint, and vision. After years of intense talks, setbacks, and outbreaks of violence, a historic agreement was reached. Apartheid would be dismantled, and South Africa would hold its first democratic election. In 1994, Nelson Mandela voted for the first time in his life, and on May 10th, he was sworn in as South Africa's first black president. The man who had once been branded a terrorist by many now stood as a global symbol of hope. His inauguration wasn't just political, it was spiritual. It was the moment that South Africa, long divided, took its first breath of unity. Mandela's presidency was not one of revenge, but one of reconciliation. He understood that a nation broken by centuries of violence needed more than a new leader, it needed healing. His government faced daunting challenges: a shattered economy, a divided population, and a legacy of mistrust. But Mandela led with grace, humor, and unmatched moral authority. He launched the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where perpetrators of apartheid crimes could confess publicly and victims could speak their pain. It was raw, emotional, and controversial, but it allowed the country to begin healing. He also worked to unite South Africans through sport, famously wearing a Springbok rugby jersey, once a hated symbol of white dominance, to support the national team. When South Africa won the 1995 Rugby World Cup, Mandela handed the trophy to the white captain, Francois Pienaar, uniting millions in a moment few thought possible. Mandela chose only to serve one term as president, stepping down in 1999 to set an example of democratic transition. He believed leadership was not about clinging to power, but passing it on with dignity. Though his presidency faced criticism especially on issues like HIV/AIDS and economic inequality, Mandela's true legacy wasn't only in policy. It was in principle. He taught the world that courage means standing tall when others kneel, that peace is not weakness, and that forgiveness is the most radical act of power. In his final years, Mandela became the world's elder statesman, a gentle giant who used his voice to promote peace, education, and global justice. He founded the Nelson Mandela Foundation, spoke at the United Nations, and supported campaigns against poverty and disease. He received more than 250 honors, including the Nobel Peace Prize, and inspired presidents, poets, and schoolchildren across continents. But Mandela's greatest gift was not fame, it was example. He showed that one man, armed with principle and persistence, could transform history. He lived not without pain or regret. He admitted he was not a saint, but he lived fully, with humility and deep purpose. Mandela passed away on December 5, 2013, at the age of 95. His death was mourned by the world, but his life continues to light the path for those still walking through darkness. His funeral, attended by leaders from every corner of the globe, was not only a farewell, it was a call to continue the work he had started. From a barefoot boy in a rural village to the president of a fractured nation, Nelson Mandela's journey is proof that courage is more powerful than fear, and that love, when chosen over hate, can rewrite the future. His story teaches us that struggle is not the opposite of strength, but the very source of it. That leadership is not about domination, but about service. That even when locked in a tiny cell, a man can remain free in his mind and become a lighthouse for generations. Mandela didn't free South Africa alone, but without him, freedom would have been delayed or lost entirely. In a world where injustice still thrives and division grows, Mandela's voice still echoes. It always seems impossible until it is done. That is his gift to us, a reminder that hope is a weapon, and that the arc of history, though long, still bends toward justice when pulled by hands like his. Today, as you watch this story, let it not end with his death. Let it begin with your life. Because Mandela's story belongs to all of us, and it is still being written. Finally, Nelson Mandela showed us that even after 27 years in a prison cell, a man can still walk out with love in his heart and peace in his hands. He proved that true strength lies in forgiveness, not revenge. His voice may be silent, but his message echoes across generations. That one person can change the world with courage, patience, and hope. Mandela, your light lives on.